Welcome to Sensing the Signal. I'm Terry Patar from Atreides. We're exploring the overlap between data, technology and intelligence in our increasingly volatile and complex world, what this means for national security and how deeper insight can help organisations make better decisions. I've spent the past 20 years helping organisations improve their intelligence capabilities. I'm fascinated by how we understand the world around us. Now I get to talk to some of the leading voices who I've learned from myself. In this episode, I caught up with one of the most interesting thinkers I've had the pleasure to talk with, Sally Walker, a former director at GCHQ, where she was joint leader of the UK National Cyber Force. Sally's background in intelligence and leadership informs her current work, putting people at the centre of how organisations use information. Sally, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure.
So, Sally, I was really keen to talk to you actually because I've noticed a lot of the work that you're doing right now is focused on some really fascinating areas where you're, as in terms of organisations you're working with, etc., and other things you're doing, you're focused on that overlap between people, technology, the information environment that we're all in, and thinking about the roles of analysts and decision makers. It'd be great to get a sense from you right now of what that means in terms of what you're currently thinking about and what you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, it's an interesting space, isn't it? I find myself being asked a lot what I do, because my version one of my career was as an intelligence officer, which is an interesting background, which I can't talk very much about. And I left that just as lockdown started and found myself thinking a lot. I'm thinking a lot about where I'd come from and what I'd learned and what it meant, and challenging myself to try and work out what I'd do when I grow up. And I'm still working on that. But I find myself doing less and thinking more, and particularly thinking about the environment that we now operate in and the environment our kids are growing up in, and thinking about what that means for leadership. So working with companies on their leadership transformation programs and then on their leadership development of teams. And I am fascinated by what technology is doing to our decision making, to our learning, to our ability to absorb information, absorb data, draw conclusions from it. That's the source of intelligence work. To understand what you're being told and what it means and what you do with it and why. And it's an interesting space, but it's also really challenging to bend your brain around.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's really why I wanted to talk to you about it, because I think I've had similar sort of questions rumbling around in my head where, we deal with now masses of information, whether you're in government in an intelligence role or you're in the private sector, or whether you're simply somebody who's working in the knowledge sector. You're dealing with information all the time. And like you said, it's to feed into decision making, and especially for organisations, etc. But we live now in an environment of overwhelm. There's so much information out there people are trying to make sense of. And we live in a world of increasing disinformation as well. Those challenges are really interesting, I think, for everybody, not just people in a specific narrow field or specific roles. Are you sort of thinking about it broadly in that sense, in terms of how it's not just affecting, say, one or two sectors or industries? It is across everywhere, really.
Absolutely. And I draw my examples from working with various sectors. So both big business, big tech, big pharma, all working with local government and working with communities and looking at what we were trying to achieve. For example, during COVID lockdown, looking at what schools are trying to achieve in dealing with kids working online. The similarities and the challenges we're facing are constant, but each part of our community, our environment, our society is learning the lessons at different speeds and sometimes drawing different conclusions.
That's really interesting, yeah. And you mentioned you started your career in intelligence, and you can't talk a lot about a lot of your work in the past, but what you can discuss, it'd be great just to get a sense of how you arrived currently where you are. So talk us through that and that journey, and I think that'll give us some neat context perhaps to why you're probably the right person in the right place at the right time in terms of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I've got to try and describe this in a way it doesn't sound all like a huge accident, because a lot of it was. Yeah. So I did science at university, did natural sciences, thought I wanted to be a medic. Fortunately for the world, I'm not. So I did that, and I left university really not knowing what I wanted to do, but there was an application form that my roommate had for an organisation I didn't know anything about called GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters. So I sat their exams, and somewhat to my surprise, about 9 months later, found myself on the inside of a wire, having signed the Official Secrets Act. But if you'd actually asked the young me what I wanted to do, that was it. I thought the job was fascinating. Mm-hmm. It gave you insight. It challenged your thinking. It gave you an understanding of parts of how the world work and parts of how the world don't work. Mm. And I loved every minute of it. My early career as a young intelligence analyst was just a privilege at every moment. And I found myself being quite an unusual character. I was female in an environment that was almost exclusively male, because it had been quite difficult to continue to be employed as a female, given some of the discriminatory policies we had around we're not being allowed to be married, and then not being able to have children. There was no maternity policy, and so on and so on and so on. So I found myself being different because I was female, but even more extraordinary, I am quite an extrovert. And the community that I worked with at that stage was not. Yeah. It was a very, very introverted organisation for very good reason. Mm. The job they had done from the days of Bletchley Park forwards was one that suited the introverted brain. Mm. And I also found, because of my background in experimental psychology, that I was interested in what we now know as neuroscience. I mean, it was an emerging science then, but it wasn't much talked about in the business world. And I was interested in how the human brain worked. And again, the sort of why we did the analysis, not the what analysis we did. Right. And I was interested in people. Mm-hmm. And I was interested in strategic thinking about leadership. So I found myself constantly being promoted, which either means that you're totally incompetent or someone sees some potential in you and judgment's still out. But I found myself rising quite rapidly through the ranks and continuing to have extraordinary experiences and going around the world and doing interesting things, mostly in the field of crisis management and military support to military operations overseas. And so my version of analysis was driven by that conviction that things will happen that are beyond your control, but you have an obligation to work out what is going wrong very, very quickly with precision, and then make a plan for how to ensure that that bad thing does not happen again in the future. And it was only after I left and you process all of this, you work back and go, that's why I was doing the things I did in the order I did with the priority I gave them. So there was a combination of being mission focused around how to do the job well, and there was a part of it around being human focused of how do we bring these extraordinary people that I worked with, the very best in the world, mathematicians, computer scientists, linguists, then increasingly in the later years, data scientists, behavioural scientists. How do you bring all those skills together and ensure that we're using the human brain to its best possible potential in this enormously rich data world? So that's what I did. Right. And then I left and I realised the rest of the world wasn't doing that. And it can and it should. And that really still baffles me as to why what I see in the corporate world and in government, local government, national government, is not necessarily using data well or effectively, and is not using the human capacity well or effectively, and certainly isn't thinking about how to bring the two together. Of course, notable exceptions exist. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So thinking about your sort of career progression and the organisation you were in, and you said you had that sense of, once you were inside the organisation, of getting access perhaps to insights and information that obviously you wouldn't have had on the outside.
Was there also a challenge, though, in terms of the volume of information that you were dealing with, and the variety, etc.? All those challenges that perhaps now we see a lot more in the rest of the world. Like you said, other people are not necessarily dealing with or grappling with these challenges in the same way that perhaps you've had experience of through your career, that now you can bring to bear on those other environments, those other sectors where actually they're now being almost forced to deal with that. Well, they're being challenged by it, whether they are dealing with it or not. As you said, a lot of people aren't kind of doing much towards matching up the flow of data with the human capacity to deal with it. But presumably you've had that career of experience in doing exactly that. So do you find now there's a sort of an opening up perhaps in other areas outside of government, outside of intelligence, in the rest of the world, where everyone's suddenly having to deal with similar challenges to what you faced before, where we're all going, oh, hang on, there's now huge amounts of information out there, not least with some of the new tools and technologies that we have available now. I'm thinking generative AI, which can lead to a further expansion of content that's available. So are you sensing that people are coming around to thinking, okay, wait, we need to do something about this? Or are you still having to talk to people and educate them about, look, this is a problem that you need to deal with?
I'm afraid I genuinely do think most organisations are still at the very early days of thinking about the challenges that they face. And I remember working with a company I do leadership consultancy through, and they have a fabulous event once a year about purposeful leadership, and they bring together leaders from across the community. And there was a very senior representative of one of the telco giants there listening to me talk about technology and its challenges. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, I didn't expect to be learning from an ex-director of the intelligence community around the importance of values and ethics. But that's what I talked about, because not only is it the thing I can talk about, whereas actually what we did I couldn't really go into any detail of, but how we did it and why it was important is something I can talk about, and I think it's hugely important. But to my mind, every tech company, given our reliance on them and given the necessity of society being able to trust them, the conversation should be starting with values and ethics, not with how clever the tech is. That's a reframing for some, perhaps not all, but for some. And then the sheer challenges of data overwhelm, which again, GCHQ since Bletchley Park has had to deal with. How do we get to the thing that matters from the haystack of haystacks that we could get diverted by? And I believe that community of exceptional analysts internalise a skill set and forget to talk about it, which is that your sources can be trusted, that you understand where something could have gone wrong so that what's in front of you doesn't quite look or feel right. And what have you not got? Because, of course, if you only got part of a picture and 95% of it is unavailable to you or can't be trusted, then you might draw very different conclusions. And because that's what we did every day. So it was instinctive to us, and we forgot to talk about it.
Instinctive after, I guess, years of developing habits, and not just as individuals, but organisationally. So through the work that you did during your career at GCHQ, you obviously built up you saw the build-up of that culture of how people became good analysts by habit and by working with others and doing the things that they were doing day in, day out. Was there a culture at the time of reflection of how do we do things better, or were you unusual in the sense of actually thinking about, right, how do we do things better? Because we had the official history of GCHQ published a couple of years ago, and I thought what was fascinating in there was the description of how much the organisation has changed since the time when you joined, and what we've seen more recently as well, especially the focus, I think, on increasing diversity in the organisation. Maybe you can describe how or what sort of role that played.
Yeah, complex question. I'll try and break it down. I think
sure.
You mentioned diversity at the end, and that's where I'll start.
Okay.
Because to me, cognitive diversity is what we were driving at. People with different life experiences, people with different backgrounds. There's a fabulous book been written called Invisible Women around the unconscious bias that is generated in data sets that have been generated by a male-dominated world. And my belief is that the intelligence community instinctively recognised that gap before they could articulate what the gap was. Some of our experience with conflict overseas, where you realise you don't have native speakers, you don't have people who've lived in those countries, in those communities, in those cultures. And if you don't have that, you can't teach it or learn it. You have to have lived it. So, but it was around the thinking. That's what really mattered. That's what drove those policies, those changes. The fact we had no women in the organisation I joined, that impacted the thinking, and around how we were structured, around what processes we had, around what policies we had. So I've always been a passionate advocate for difference, driving better. And I think, the community has attempted to embrace that. It is making progress. It's not yet perfect. There's a lot more to do, as there is in wider society. So I was different, and I can't get away from that, but I wasn't unusual because there was loads of difference around the organisation, and there were lots of brilliant people. And we had to keep resetting what we did because technology was changing all the time. What struck me after I left is how little we changed how we did it, because it was driven by the law, necessity, proportionality. It was driven by really strong values of the community, that we had to be on the side of the right. And I'm conscious that's a very loaded phrase, but sorry, and I didn't mean politically, absolutely not. Neutral as they can be.
Yeah.
But that sense of a just world and a not just world, we had to believe that what we were doing was the right thing. And being driven by that, I think you internalise the constant desire to improve, be better, and identify different ways of working through the problem. And if we had any of the extraordinary men and women from Bletchley Park, I hope they would say those same belief systems were there. If you look at how they recruited into Bletchley, the recognition that they needed something different, something trusted. There's some really interesting core values that go right back to the last century of how intelligence builds on strong foundations to do a really hard job.
Yeah.
Ordinary people doing extraordinary things and all that.
Yeah. Is it difficult now, though, for those organisations where, like, you mentioned Bletchley Park, when we were in the middle of a war that was existential, and it was very clear in terms of values what was right, what was wrong. Is it harder these days when perhaps the problem sets that analysts are dealing with in those organisations aren't always so clear-cut, or that they could be affected by the myriad of information that they're seeing, which could involve disinformation as well? And how do they sort of guard against that to stop their own personal feelings and judgments being affected?
Yeah, I don't quite know how to answer that because I'm not there now, so I don't want to imply. Yeah. It's a difficult job. It's a job that the individual is employed to do it extremely well. Yeah. I would encourage everyone to have faith in the community that are working in the shadows in order to ensure they stay safe in the light and so on. But I think what I'm most interested in is how you transport that sense of national contribution out of the wire of a few thousand people, a few thousand people sitting behind a wire into society. So, and I had this conversation through one of the lecture series in Oxford just before the Ukraine war broke out. And I regret some of what I said because I predicted that the war was unlikely to happen, which obviously was proven to be a completely false assumption based on little knowledge. But what I also said was that I believed, as the mother of three boys, that we the UK, no longer have a cause that we would all be willing to fight for. Mm. And I said it to be controversial, and the Ukrainians have proven that that is the foundational premise of going to war, which is you do believe you've got something worth fighting for, and they're fighting for their survival, but they're also fighting for something much more than that, their identity, their homeland, and so on and so on. And it's an incredibly powerful motivating force. But my question to the Western world remains, what about our democratic values and our way of life would we actually fight for? And then, of course, you have to step back from fighting on the battlefield to fighting for the things that matter for you day to day. How are our corporate systems run?
Yeah.
Are they legal and just and moral? And how do we educate our children to think?
Yeah.
And what do we teach them to trust? And what do we teach them to not trust? And how do we encourage them to challenge the system that they're growing up in order that it's better? And who defines better? So as you can see, when you're thinking a lot and not doing very much, you have loads of questions and very few answers.
But they're all fascinating questions, and maybe just touching on what you mentioned there in terms of the younger generation and the types of information they're being exposed to. When I was growing up, there was no such thing as influencers, which I still find a bizarre job title, quite frankly. It would have sounded incredibly suspicious, I think, if anyone labelled themselves as an influencer years ago, but yet now it's an accepted sort of, I don't want to say career path, but it's something that that people exist doing those roles, and
they used to be called priests.
Well, I'm sure we've always had those kinds of people trying to persuade us of things, but it strikes me that now the younger generation are exposed to that far more, and in far more of a diverse array of influences that are coming at them. So is it harder for them to maybe establish their set of values, or is it more important really for the generations they may look up to give them those values? And like you said, on that day-to-day experience of us as a country or the Western democratic world, how do we instill and reinforce those values that we want to encourage?
So I briefly did some work in the education sector with a brilliant colleague around how schools were tackling the problem of social media, and it was really interesting that the focus in many schools, not all again, was on the what. So what are kids using, and how do we stop them, and how do we how do we influence children? And there wasn't a huge amount of conversation around the why it matters. And that why is around their identity, around their values, around their belief systems, around the approach to life that they are going to take, and what they care about and why that matters. And if you tell a child that their digital identity could be stolen, they don't care, because there's no why in it for them. If you tell them that they're going to limit their future career choices because some jobs will not be available to them if they have compromised their identity in various ways, it starts a different conversation. But you need a maturity to that debate. And schools are in overwhelm just as companies are in overwhelm. They're just trying to manage the day-to-day risk and the day-to-day environment that their pupils are in. And they're not able to have the conversation that perhaps we need.
Yeah, and you mentioned there are companies and organisations outside of government, and so you talked earlier about how what's gone on in the sort of intelligence world perhaps has translated into other sectors more recently in terms of having to deal with this flood of information and how to relay that into human thinking and decision making. But establishing values, is that much harder or how much harder is it for companies and other organisations outside of government, where you mentioned, for example, with the intelligence agencies, the values are enshrined in law to some extent, but not so much the case in the corporate sector, and yet we are in a sort of contested world now where actually the private sector plays a really important role. And so have you had any sort of, what have you been thinking around that? I'm sure you have been thinking about it.
Well, it's interesting because one of the untruths that kept a lot of us in the civil service was this conviction that we had mission and purpose and values, and the corporate sector didn't have that stuff. And of course, once you've had the privilege of working with the best teams and the best of the corporate sector, their values are absolutely enshrined in everything they do. And they do have that sense of mission and purpose, because it's a human belief system, and that's how you drive corporate standards and corporate behaviours. So I think a lot of organisations do get this. What has been fascinating working recently with local government, where values are seen as important and strong, is that they are now a recruitment. They're a incentive for talent to join organisations. We are having people coming into interviews saying, never mind the pension, never mind the pay. I know that's important to everyone, especially in a cost of living crisis, but people are actually saying the reason I'm walking through the door is because I like your values. Which is interesting, because if that's true and real, then we can start having a different conversation with our employees and with our organisations around, so what? What do we do? How do we deal with this data? What kind of organisation do we want to be? And phrases like corporate social responsibility and environmental and sustainability goals become real because they genuinely matter to organisations, rather than something that you put on the wall and refresh once a year at the corporate offsite.
For sure, and I think that certainly mirrors sort of my experience in terms of, I think the most successful organisations are the ones that do have very clear values. And you're right, it absolutely has a knock-on effect in terms of attracting better talent. It's a competitive advantage. It also, I think, drives more employee willingness to go the extra mile, or to actually really contribute to their organisation. Whereas I think what you find is with organisations that don't necessarily have that, they just don't get the same level of engagement from potential recruits or from the people who currently work there. And it's in terms of long-term sustainability of the organisations themselves, I think, absolutely, the best organisations will have those values. Are they having to moderate any of that or change any of that to help them deal with the sort of technology and information environment that they're in?
I think they're having to think really hard and not necessarily always getting it right about the complexity of the world. Right. So one of the most difficult conversations I've had in a development workshop was, again, on the back of the Ukraine crisis breaking out, with someone who is pro-Russian. And my moral standpoint is quite clear on that conflict. And my children say it's a little bit too black and white. They think there's two sides to the conflict, which is interesting in terms of the conversation. But having that conversation with someone who saw the whole challenge very differently was hard. Yeah. Important. It's part of modern society, modern democracy. But corporations who are saying, well, we're playing both and, that's not cutting it. Yeah. So people are having to make choice. And I'm not even going to start on the current crisis in the Middle East, because that is such a complex world. Yeah. And there are a variety of different viewpoints representing different value systems, different belief systems. And most of us are incompetent to unravel that and unpick it. And there's a huge amount of emotion and hurt and challenge in all of that. So but that's the geopolitical world. The reason for mentioning it and mentioning how hard it is technology plays into that. Well, do we really think that's the role of a corporate board or the CEO of an organisation to decide who lives and who dies? I have a problem with that. Yeah. But then I came from a world where we had a very strong ethical framework and a governance framework. And we, as the analysts, did not make the choice, and we put it through a process all the way up through the National Security Council and into government. And we might not like the government of the day, and we might not like who's been elected, but at least it is clear and transparent what that process is to make that decision. With tech being so ubiquitous and so powerful and so vital to how the lifeblood of our planet functions, there is so much responsibility in the boardroom now. And we, as citizens, have not elected those people to make those decisions. And do we care?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. I mean, as you talked about there, where you've got technology companies, you've got other companies that will have a potentially direct impact on geopolitical issues, crises, conflicts. They've got to really think carefully about what is their position. But when they are multinational organisations, I guess it becomes even more complex when we're talking about national rivalries or conflict. For individuals in those organisations, how do they also sort of relate to what's going on around them in the wider world in terms of, like I said, they're going to be seeing information from all kinds of different sources, potentially positioned from different viewpoints and perspectives. Is it the case that now people are struggling more than ever before to make sense of the world around them because there isn't? I know it's become a bit of a cliche to knock some of the sort of mainstream news organisations and things and say, well, people don't always trust where they're getting their information from. But is there more education that needs to be done to help people with things like critical thinking skills to be able to decipher all of these information sources that are coming at them, so that they can decide for themselves within those organisations, not just sort of what they think, but also perhaps influencing what position their organisations should take?
My goodness, I mean, there's a few books to write on this subject, aren't there? There's some fascinating and counterintuitive psychology, and I can't remember all the detail. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to become convinced by conspiracy theories, for example, because actually your capacity to absorb information is greater, but your biases become stronger because you absorb information and then filter out the stuff that you don't like.
Wow.
So you believe you've seen an awful lot of data that confirms you're right. And the more educated you are, the more you have been told your whole life that you are right. Mm-hmm. So, what's trust, what's truth, where do we go? I had a conversation with another ex-intelligence officer around this, saying I wanted to write a book on trust and truth or something. And he laughed and said, we used to believe in the church and in kings and queens. And now we believe in the god of tech. And, but my concern is, and it's a question I don't have an answer to it. Information is now so powerful. I can make you believe anything. I can make my kids believe anything. And unfortunately, the Chinese can make my kids believe anything because TikTok is a media, is a state propaganda tool. But what do we want them to believe? Because it's actually not for me to tell you what to believe or think. Or we used to produce textbooks and say, read that and you'll be educated in chemistry. But now we've got the world of information at our fingertips, and some of it's good and some of it's dross and some of it's but what's the stat? We generate more data every minute than the ancient Greeks stored in an entire civilization. How much of that do we actually need? How much of it is utter junk? How much of it are we in an obesity crisis for our brains? We are just stuffing our brains full of junk day in, day out, and we're not talking about it. And then that's contributing to a climate crisis, and then you end up in a sort of ecosystem of self-reinforcing nonsense. So kill cat videos, first queen for a day, let's just stop. We used to talk about having no email for a day to try and give people relief from the relentless battering. Yeah. And now we're scrolling. Yeah. Watching, I was standing somewhere in London yesterday just watching humans interact with their phones. And we all scroll constantly. And it's junk food for our brains. And you're not thinking if you're doing the thumb of doom.
Oh, that's really
sorry, I don't think I answered any of your questions there. But,
but it's interesting because you've just described really clearly there what the challenge is for people now, where we are. Yeah, exactly as you described. We're living in this information obesity environment where we are being pumped full of junk food almost on a daily basis, and the way that a lot of that information is designed to be delivered, it's very addictive. And it is hard for people to break away. And
as you said, people don't trust the news organisations, but they'll trust the PR department of a major corporate whose job it is to spin the data they've got to present the story in a good light.
Yeah,
And
especially if it agrees with what they already believe or think. And,
there's certainly, there's an awful lot of money that goes into advertising and making sure that the politicians used to get in all sorts of trouble if they said it was a good day to bury a bad news story. But that's what a PR department does.
Yeah.
And there's no control on it.
Yeah. I mean, it's strange because you would think
information is a weapon.
Yeah, it is. But it's strange in a way in that you'd think, okay, we have so much access to information now. If anything, there should be easier avenues for people to discover what's going on in the world. But it's much harder, actually. And
so much harder.
Yeah. And
how do you get to truth? I did an experiment for myself in the early days, again, Russia-Ukraine war, looking at Facebook feed or something, looking at claims of war crimes on one side and claims of war crimes on the other. It's the most unscientific experiment, but measuring my own emotional response to the two.
Interesting.
Knowing what my belief system is and knowing the credibility of both stories. Mm-hmm. Both stories have probably got some grounding in reality because otherwise either side wouldn't be using them in the way they did. My emotional response to one set of stories was totally different from my emotional response. One I discounted and one I believed. And this was with me testing my own, not how to do a scientific experiment at all. But I just thought that was fascinating. And I hear my boys running in with some video that's designed to trigger an emotional response, telling me that, and I will try and step them back and say, who sent it to you?
Yeah.
Why do you think that was filmed? Like, genuinely, that's really odd that someone just happened to have a camera at just the moment that really strange thing that makes no sense happened in front of you. So why do you think it was filmed? What else could be going on?
Yeah.
And they will default to, I trusted it because it came from a friend.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the person who sent it to me is reliable, and therefore the information is reliable, which worked for us when we were telling stories down the generations or across the tribes or communicating a sensible amount of information. It wasn't worth passing on something that wasn't true, although rumour passes faster than truth. But
well, and also probably when we were in smaller communities of information gathering like that, you probably learned over time which were the people who likely exaggerated the most or, embellished stories, etc. And so you learned how much to gauge your level of trust in what you were hearing. Whereas I think now that's much more difficult for people because we are slightly more disconnected as well. People are, engaging with others around the world. You don't necessarily know them that well. You may not have met them. You're going to be getting information from all kinds of places, really. And it's, much harder to know what to believe and what not to.
And that 101 of being an intelligence analyst, do you know and trust your source? That's gone out the window.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, except for people who do work in that field, but
hopefully there's some left. It's a skill set.
Yeah, probably the question I get asked most often by analysts I'm sort of working with is, right, but how do you know that? And they always want to go back to the origin point of how do you know exactly what you've just told me? Which is great because I love it when they ask that question. But that's something that maybe needs to translate across into general population and actually, comes through education perhaps. I don't know. But then, like you said before, we're putting an extra burden and responsibility on the education sector when they can't handle that on their own. And so
we also treat education as interrogation of the known environment.
Right.
And now the known environment is huge.
Yeah.
We think that the skill set is to look at what's in front of us. The skill set is to understand what isn't in front of us. What do we not know?
Yeah.
And why? What's missing? And those are questions I just don't see getting asked enough in the corporate world, in government, and in schools.
And Sally, you talked about your sons coming to you with information that they're getting from their friends or whoever it might be, and the difficulty in getting them to think critically perhaps about how they're assessing that information and why it's created in the first place, why they're seeing it. Do you have any advice or tips for other people in the same situation, parents maybe, who are dealing with that same challenge?
It's really hard because, as with everything in parenting, you've got a spectrum of choice from do nothing and let them get on with it, because it's the Wild West out there and they're going to have to learn to navigate it at some stage, to try and control their lives for as long as possible. And a lot of the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are not letting their children have the technology that they sell to the rest of the world. I'm in a difficult place because I can scare the living bejesus out of anyone if you want detail of how unsafe the tech environment can be. So the speed at which an 11-year-old boy can get to very, very unpleasant pornography that they really shouldn't see is in seconds, not in days. And I just don't think that should happen. And, you know, government is putting the frameworks in place to try and persuade the tech companies and everybody involved to stop that from being possible. I have friends who will not allow their children into the physical environment because of an overinflated sense of fear about what might happen to them or what the risks are out there in the big bad world, but will let their children sit on an iPad in their bedrooms with no supervision whatsoever. And to my mind, knowing what I do, that isn't perhaps a conscious choice, and we could have different conversations around the choices that you might make for your children. Equally, I'm a parent. I've tried to not give my child a phone until and lost that argument. And I have regrets over some of it because I see them with habits and behaviours. It's the obesity crisis, right? I know that my child spending 4 hours playing Clash of Clans is not the most productive or responsible use of his time. But he's a kid and all of his friends are doing it, and therefore he wants to be part of that. So it's the thinking, not the doing, right? So I think it's around the conversations that you have with your children. It's around the questions that you ask them about whether they are actually conscious of what they're doing and whether they are able to frame the environment in which they're operating to make better choices. Just as we would with the physical world. Have you had have had enough exercise, sleep and food? Have you had enough time off your screen? Are you thoughtful about who you're in communication with? And do you know the sources of the information? If not, what do you want to do? My 16-year-old has deleted TikTok from his own phone without me saying you can't use TikTok because that's not going to work. My younger son, perhaps.
But it's
less conscious choice.
Well, it's interesting you mention that. I mean, I've heard more from, I know this is completely anecdotal, but I've heard more from friends recently also mentioning they're deleting social media apps from their phones because they're just finding they're not useful to them, actually. And they are a distraction, they are addictive, they're designed to be addictive, and we know that. And I think that actually people are weighing up the balance now of, okay, is it worth me being on there so that I don't miss out on anything that my friends might see or share or whatever, versus is my time better spent doing something else? And yeah, maybe that's something that we may at some point in the future reach a tipping point towards, or hopefully people, or that understanding will grow amongst people about that actually there needs to be a balance.
I think there's a really powerful conversation around the things that we're not supposed to talk about. So the emotion that drives social media becoming toxic is shame. And we're not good as humans as having conversations around shame. And teenage girls are particularly susceptible to it, and that's how cyberbullying manifests. They are shamed into believing things, and then they can't have conversations with their parents because they're uncomfortable around it. And so we need to reframe the conversation in the real world in order to manage the challenges in the digital world.
Interesting. Yeah. And do you I mean, because I know you're advising a lot of organisations about leadership and decision making. How do you feel that plays through into decision making and leadership? And are they, are things being missed in the way that organisations are being led and the way they're formulating strategy or making other kinds of decisions because they don't necessarily appreciate the information they're working with?
I think a lot of organisations are realising the power of leadership is the ability to ask great questions, not to know all the answers. And that's the start of the journey. The challenge is, where are you getting your information from? Yeah. And that's a huge problem. And the human brain is not conditioned to work well over time. So if we hear Old Testament story, we process it in the same way as we hear a story about what your neighbour did yesterday. Like we can't recognise that time dimension. Right. But equally, information stores don't tag things as that was 10 years ago, that was 5 years ago, that was yesterday, that's more likely to be tomorrow. Pattern analysis over time is really, really challenging for us. So the old challenges in organisations around corporate wisdom, corporate learning, corporate memory are compounded when you've got these massive data stores, but no real ability to match them to time.
Interesting. And within that, does that mean people really struggle to infer meaning from information because they treat it all the same?
They struggle to learn lessons.
Right.
And identify problems that are happening repeatedly. So a problem is something that happens once, and how big was the problem? So we get drawn to crisis. And that becomes all-consuming. Right. But actually a crisis could be a lot of small things happening repeatedly every day for a year.
Yeah. Which people won't necessarily pick up on because it becomes a daily
That's
occurrence.
Just daily grind. That's just a bit of grit in the system.
Yeah. Yeah. Micro stresses. There's a lot of micro stresses in organisations that people don't think about, which actually I think...
If you fixed.
Yeah, if you fixed, you'd clear some of that cognitive burden perhaps. And I mean, I'm maybe being over-optimistic here, but you'd maybe give people the potential to think more clearly when they are looking at information that they've got to make decisions on.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, part of your work is to help organisations deal with those issues?
I'd love to, because it's interesting, the gap of what people think they want about big thinking about the future. And tech is still seen as a tool.
Right.
Not as the environment we work in. So it's still, please can I have a system, a thing that does a job. We are still in the doing world, not in the thinking world.
Interesting.
And AI is playing into that. How do we make everything more efficient and effective?
Yeah.
Well, AI is quite good at that.
Yeah.
How do we make it better?
That's a different question.
It's a really different question, and the answer might be fundamentally different.
So you mean creating perhaps a completely different environment? Interesting. I just wanted to maybe, because I know you think a lot about all these different issues, and there's lots of questions that you're spending time working through. Is there one question in particular that is really the focus or at the heart of what you're thinking about right now?
What do you trust? And why?
Fascinating. I guess that cuts across every organisation, every role.
It's a value system for me, but it's also core to leadership. You can't lead well if people don't trust you, or if you don't trust the system that you're working in. And that interface between human and tech, we've not got it right yet.
Interesting.
What can we trust? How can we check? How can we challenge constructively, effectively? And how do we build a system that works for all of us?
I mean, I wasn't going to necessarily ask a question about cyber, because I know you often get tagged with the cyber label,
and
having set up the National Cyber Force.
Correct.
But I wanted to focus this conversation really on the people challenges, but that, because that's where your focus lies, I guess. But in terms of that interface between people and technology, where does the impetus lie really in terms of how do things have to change? Do the people have to adapt to the technology they've got, or do we have to find ways to re-engineer the technology environment? Because I'm not sure which is the bigger challenge there.
There's a phrase I think that's been coined by someone in Google, which is about computers doing the thinking. So the automatic process, the speed and scale. Our automatic systems are great at that. But the thinking, that's human. So I believe, and I'm working with a startup that has come out of Australia and has now got a nearly global footprint, that human potential, understanding what that is and ensuring that technology supports that, that's going to be the answer to the future in every sector. It's the answer to the skills challenge. It's the answer to a fixation on. The reason I smiled at you, which you can't see on a podcast, I understand, but, hopefully you can hear it in the voice, the entertainment. I mean, the debates we had around what cyber is and isn't, I mean, they were legion and they went on for days.
Yeah.
Well, I know we
could probably do an entire podcast about the cyber domain.
Please don't.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, we're people living on the planet, and we've got to find a way to navigate ourselves through the future. And tech is a vital part of that. But tech has to help people have a better life and define better. And that's something only we can do. Whether it's artificial or real, computers are not going to design our lives for us. We've got to make choices.
Absolutely.
And we've got to think about what matters to us and then set out to deliver it.
Yeah. And I think just for people listening, the reason I guess we sort of laugh about the term the cyber domain is just because it's essentially we're talking about information when we talk about cyber in so many ways. And, it's...
Cyber isn't information. Information isn't cyber.
But, it's... I think classifying these things in domains in sort of, or trying to put definitions around them is a way for us to organise around things, isn't it? But it's a way for people to try and create a common understanding of things. But it can so often be so limiting.
The case study I used to illustrate the power of offensive cyber, which is the program I ran, which is, how to make tech not do what it's supposed to do. Mm-hmm. The case study for that is VW emissions scandal.
Right.
Computer systems didn't do what the design manual said they did. Mm-hmm. And that stops you from being able to trust the data within those systems. Mm-hmm. And that is a fundamental problem. And it's a societal challenge, and it's a tech challenge. Is that cyber? Is that information? And it's really hard to go to people who work in what we in the security world call the critical national infrastructure, and to other people it's the national grid, or it's our water systems, or it actually includes logistics to get food to supermarkets, because if you can't get the food to the supermarket, then you have a challenge in not very many days' time. But that lifeblood of how we operate day to day, how we live our lives, is now technically enabled. Computers say which food goes to which supermarket. They manage our distribution networks. They manage our electricity systems. They manage the testing of our car engines. So if the tech goes wrong, we have a challenge. But it's a human challenge, and it's a challenge for that bit of society or that bit of the corporate world. Yeah. But as soon as we put the cyber label on it, everyone reaches for the IT department and picks the phone up and goes, please, can you fix the tech? And they don't say, please, can you fix the system? And please, can you think differently about how we make sure this never happens again? Because that's a board challenge, or it's a leadership challenge, or it's an education challenge. So the further I get from government, the more the cyber label makes me have a wry smile on my face, because we couldn't agree in government what it meant, and we certainly don't know what it means outside of government.
Sally, this has been absolutely fascinating. Where can people go? Where would you want to direct them to find out more about the work that you're doing and the things you're thinking about? I know you mentioned a couple of organisations you're involved in. Maybe this is an opportunity to sort of mention those. One thing I would say is I've been really enjoying your posts on LinkedIn, and I would recommend people to have a look at your posts there. Thank you. Whenever you have posted recently, I've just found myself reading and sort of nodding in agreement with everything you've been writing. So
I very rarely write. I steal other people's thinking. So,
Well, that's the art of creativity.
Share. So a couple of organisations, and thank you for the opportunity. So I'm Human Digital Thinking. Get in touch with me. I'm always interested in what other people are thinking. I haven't got any solutions for you, but I'm interested in the conversation.
But you'll be able to encourage them to ask the right questions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
That's the first question. With You, With Me is the startup that I work with that are looking at human potential over experience. So that's thinking really hard about how we encourage people to do things they didn't think they were capable of, and using a digital platform to explore what's on the inside of your brain and encourage you into a career pathway. So really exciting, really believe in their values proposition, and they're very socially minded as an enterprise. They work with veterans, with minority communities, with all sorts around the globe. And I do quite a lot of leadership work with Clarity Leadership, so that's the third pillar. So any of those three organisations, or just ask yourself why.
Brilliant. Sally, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Talking to Sally really emphasised for me the emphasis that needs to be placed on improving critical thinking skills across the board, and kind of taking those skills out of being just part of the intelligence profession where they've been developed for so many decades to being implemented across all kinds of areas of knowledge work. And at the same time, when we talk about tech, we need to think about it as an environment. Within that environment, we need to think about building in those ethical safeguards that can help us deal with information, misinformation, disinformation, all of those challenges that we have right now, rather than simply trying to use tech as a tool that is trying to squeeze more information into people's minds, more data, and then squeeze out more productivity. And I loved Sally's point that we're often overwhelmed by the information that we can see, and we just don't do enough to think about what we're not seeing and why. And for me, that's what intelligence is all about, and where human analysts play a vital role in trying to understand not just what's there, but also what is missing. What to trust and why? That's the fundamental question Sally posed here. How do we verify the information we're consuming when we're so overloaded amid this obesity crisis of information? This, for me, gets to the heart of some of the biggest challenges we face, whether adults or children, intelligence analysts or other professionals. How do we verify what we're seeing and hearing online? Who do we believe? Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Atreides, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at atreides.io.